It was a typical evening in Los Angeles. The city was alive, but high above the streets, nestled on a hill, Keanu Reeves's mansion stood in quiet solitude. The lights of the city flickered far below, and the air carried the faint hum of distant traffic. In the comfort of his expansive home, Keanu had just finished another long day of filming. His usual routine, quiet evenings, simple meals and a chance to relax, was all he wanted after a grueling shoot. But tonight would be anything but ordinary. A group of thieves, slick and seasoned, had been watching the mansion for weeks. They'd done their homework. They knew that Keanu traveled frequently, often disappearing for days at a time, leaving his mansion vulnerable. It was the perfect target. The plan was simple: break in, grab what they could, and leave before anyone noticed. No one would be the wiser. They arrived at the mansion after dark, under the cover of the night. Moving quickly and silently, they approached the back of the house. They knew where the security cameras were and how to avoid them. They had all the right tools, devices to disable alarms, gadgets to open locks. Nothing could go wrong. Or so they thought. As they crept inside, the mansion's cold marble floors echoed beneath their boots. The house was enormous, every inch of it pristine and perfectly decorated. They weren't sure what exactly they were looking for: jewelry, electronics, anything of value, but they were confident they'd find something worth taking. They moved cautiously through the halls, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Every creak of the floorboard seemed too loud, but they pressed on, inching toward the grand living room. Then, without warning, a soft mechanical hum filled the air. The thieves froze. It wasn't an alarm, not the loud, blaring kind they'd expected. This was something different, something far more sinister. They had triggered something they hadn't anticipated. A voice, calm and emotionless, crackled through hidden speakers in the walls. "You're not supposed to be here." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, sending a chill down their spines. Who said that?" one of the thieves whispered, panic creeping into his voice. No answer. Only the eerie hum of the mansion's security system, now fully aware of their presence. The thieves exchanged nervous glances. They had underestimated the house. This wasn't just some mansion with basic security. It was a fortress, and they had just walked into the heart of it. Their carefully laid plans were unraveling fast. One thief, the more experienced of the group, tried to stay calm. "We need to go," he muttered, already heading for the exit. But something about the house didn't feel right. It was too quiet, too controlled. They weren't alone. The mansion's lights flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows across the walls. The thieves paused, unsure of whether to press forward or retreat. But the decision was made for them. Another voice, now more distinct, echoed through the house. "You have 5 minutes before I activate the lockdown." A sense of dread washed over them. They knew they were trapped. The door they had entered through was already locked. The security system had anticipated their every move. And then, to make matters worse, the faint sound of footsteps reached their ears. Someone or something was coming. The air felt thick with tension. The thieves had no idea who or what they were dealing with, but they knew one thing: they had made a terrible mistake. The clock was ticking. The thieves stood frozen in the center of the mansion's grand hallway, their breath quickening, their hearts racing. Every second felt like an eternity. The voice that had come through the speakers was still ringing in their ears. "You have 5 minutes before I activate the lockdown." One of the thieves, a lanky man named Mike, nervously checked the time on his phone. 3 minutes and counting. The security system was fast, too fast for them to escape without help. Mike felt his pulse hammering in his throat. "We need to move now," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. His partner, Tony, the mastermind, behind the heist, glanced around, trying to locate the source of the voice that had warned them. "Who's playing games with us? This is way bigger than we thought." He took a step forward, his mind racing through every possible escape route, but every direction seemed wrong. The marble floors, the high ceilings, everything about this mansion screamed danger. And there was something else, something off. The way the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twitch, the way the air felt too still, like they were being watched. They weren't alone. The third thief, Jesse, pulled out a small device from his jacket pocket, a sophisticated tool to disable security alarms and cameras. He fumbled with it, trying to regain control of the mansion's systems, but it was no use. The mansion's security was unlike anything they'd ever encountered. No matter how hard they tried, the alarms kept going off, growing louder with each passing second. "Come on, Jesse," Mike urged, his voice trembling. "We don't have much time." But Jesse was already shaking his head, sweat dripping down his face. "It's not working. Whatever this place is, it's locked down tighter than Fort Knox." Tony, the leader of the group, swore under his breath. This wasn't how he'd planned it. They were supposed to get in, grab a few valuables, and get out. Now they were caught in a web they couldn't escape. From the speakers, the voice came, again colder this time. "You have 4 minutes." The pressure was unbearable. The thieves' minds raced, trying to figure out how to escape. But the mansion was like a maze, each turn leading them further into its cold, unwelcoming depths. Suddenly, the air shifted. The shadows in the hallway grew longer, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood on end. There was no denying it. Now the mansion was alive, and it was watching them. Without warning, the hallway lights flickered out, plunging them into darkness. Mike cursed loudly, his hand shooting out to grab Tony's arm. "What the hell is going on?" Then from the shadows came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the empty space. It was coming closer. "Who's there?" Tony demanded, his voice shaky, but he was trying to hold it together. He had to. He was the leader. If he fell apart, the whole group would collapse. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was suffocating. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in on them. "Get ready," Jesse whispered, pulling out his gun. "Whoever it is, they won't get the drop on us." Mike's hand shook as he gripped his crowbar. "What if we're not alone? What if someone else is in here?" Before anyone could respond, a voice, this time not from the speakers, but from somewhere, just ahead, cut through the air. "Did you think you could just walk into my home and take whatever you wanted?" The voice was deep, steady, and somehow familiar. The thieves turned toward the source, their eyes straining in the dark. A figure stepped into the dim light, his silhouette tall and lean, the outline of his face partially visible. It wasn't Keanu Reeves. This man was older, with a hardened expression that told the thieves everything they needed to know. This wasn't just anyone. This was someone who knew how to handle business, and wasn't afraid to do what it took to protect what was his. "I am the one who's been keeping watch over this place," the man said, his voice even, but his words carried a weight that sent a shiver down the thieves' spines. "You are trespassing on my turf, and that's a mistake you won't walk away from." Jesse aimed his gun at the man, his hands shaking. "Stay back, we don't want trouble." But the man didn't flinch. "You've already brought the trouble to my doorstep. Now you're going to pay for it." Tony stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Look, we didn't know you were here. We thought the place was empty." The man gave a cold laugh. "Empty? Never. This mansion has eyes, and I'm always watching." Before they could react, the lights flickered back on, revealing the full scope of the room they were in. A grand, imposing hallway with walls lined with expensive art and antique furniture. And in the middle of it all stood the man who had trapped them here. He wasn't alone. As the lights brightened, they saw 2 other figures appear from the shadows, both dressed in black, each carrying an air of authority. The thieves were cornered. The tension in the room was thick. The sound of the ticking clock was the only thing, breaking the silence as the thieves realized they weren't just up against a regular security system. Whoever these people were, they were trained, and they weren't afraid to do whatever it took to protect the mansion. The countdown continued. The thieves' breathing grew heavy, and their hearts pounded in their chests. The man who had emerged from the shadows was calm, his eyes sharp, like a predator sizing up its prey. His stance was confident, almost predatory. The other 2 figures flanked him, their movements calculated and precise. This wasn't just some hired help, this was something else entirely. Mike swallowed hard, his palms slick with sweat as he clutched the crowbar. The heavy air around him felt thick with impending doom. "What do you want from us?" he asked, trying to hide the tremor in his voice, though he couldn't mask the fear in his eyes. The man didn't respond immediately. He simply studied the three of them as if determining their worth in a single glance. His eyes narrowed, and then he took a slow step forward. "You're trespassing," the man said in a low, measured voice, "and when people trespass on my property, they face the consequences." Tony, trying to muster some form of control, stepped in front of the others. "We just wanted to get in and out. No harm, no foul, okay? We didn't know about your security or you. Just let us go and we'll forget this ever happened." This man's lips twitched into a faint, almost amused smile. "You think you can just walk in here and walk out like nothing happened? This isn't the kind of place where you get a second chance." Jesse, still holding his gun, took a few steps back, his eyes darting around for any potential escape route. The house was like a labyrinth. Every corner seemed to turn into another hallway, another locked door. He realized they were trapped in here, and the walls seemed to be closing in on them. "We need to get out," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The man didn't seem to care about their panic. He just stared at them with an eerie calmness, waiting. The seconds stretched into eternity as the thieves were locked in place by the weight of his presence. But then, just as they thought things couldn't get worse, the house seemed to shift. A low hum began vibrating through the walls. It started faintly, then grew louder, almost like the sound of a massive engine warming up. The lights flickered again, and the air seemed to get colder. The thieves exchanged uneasy glances, the realization creeping in that this wasn't just about them anymore. Something else was at play. "Who is that?" Mike asked, his voice barely audible, his eyes wide with fear. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he nodded to one of the figures beside him, who stepped forward. The second figure, a tall woman, with sharp features and an air of authority, reached up and pressed a button on the wall. The wall beside them seemed to split open, revealing a hidden control panel. "Another layer of security," the man said, his voice cold and distant. "In case people like you get any funny ideas." The thieves could only watch in stunned silence as the woman manipulated the controls. A loud click echoed through the hall, and the sound of locks disengaging could be heard throughout the mansion. The entire house had just shifted into a higher state of lockdown. "That's it," Jesse said, his voice cracking with panic. "We're done. We're not getting out of here." Mike and Tony exchanged a nervous glance. Their plan had been flawless until they'd stepped into this place. Now they were no longer in control, and every second they stayed felt like a second closer to their inevitable capture. The man looked at them once more, as if reading their thoughts. "I'm giving you a choice," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You can continue to fight, try to make it out alive, or you can surrender and face the consequences of your actions." Tony's mind raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "We didn't hurt anyone," he said desperately. "We didn't mean to cause trouble. We just thought—" "You thought?" the man interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "You thought you could get away with breaking into my home? Thought you could steal from me and leave unscathed?" Mike stepped back, eyes wide with realization. "This place, it's not just a mansion, is it? There's something bigger going on here." The man's expression remained unchanged. "You're right? This place is more than a mansion. It's a fortress, a sanctuary, and you've just made the mistake of trying to breach it." A sudden noise interrupted the tense silence, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching rapidly from another part of the house. It wasn't just one person. There were multiple people coming closer. The thieves' eyes widened as they realized something far more sinister was unfolding. Whatever this place was, it was clearly not just about wealth or status. It was about power, control, and something much darker that none of them could have imagined. The man gestured for the thieves to follow him as he turned toward the direction of the footsteps. "I hope you're ready for what comes next." The footsteps grew louder, and it was clear that the mansion's secrets were only just beginning to be revealed. The footsteps grew louder, the sound reverberating off the marble floors, echoing through the hallway like a drumbeat of impending doom. The thieves exchanged desperate glances. It was clear they weren't just in the presence of someone powerful. No, this was something far more terrifying. The mansion wasn't just a home, it was a stronghold, a place where people came and went at their own peril. And now they were trapped inside it, caught in a game they didn't even understand. The man who had been leading them turned without a word, striding confidently toward the approaching footsteps. His movements were fluid, controlled. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, as if the mansion was an extension of himself. "Follow me," he ordered, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Tony, always the leader, hesitated. He wanted to challenge the man, to demand answers, but something in the cold, calculating way the man moved told him that this wasn't the time. He gestured for Mike and Jesse to follow and reluctantly fell in step behind the man. The group moved through the long corridors, past rooms they had not noticed before. The house seemed to expand with every step, as if it were alive and aware of their every move. They passed through grand chambers filled with antiques and artwork, their shadows stretching long across the floors as the lights flickered overhead. They finally reached a large, imposing door. The man paused in front of it, turning to face the thieves. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity. "This is where the real conversation happens," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Jesse's grip on his gun tightened. He glanced nervously at Mike and Tony. None of them had any idea what they were walking into. The door swung open with a soft hiss, revealing a dimly lit room that looked nothing like the rest of the mansion. It was a stark contrast to the elegance and opulence of the rest of the house. The walls were lined with shelves full of old books and strange artifacts. In the center of the room stood a large metal table, its surface cluttered with papers, devices, and strange, unfamiliar objects. At the far end of the room, a woman stood, her back to them. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, and she wore a simple black outfit that matched the seriousness of her expression. The man stepped inside, motioning for the thieves to follow. "This is Eleanor," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "She runs things here." Eleanor turned slowly, her piercing gaze locking onto each of the thieves in turn. "So, you thought you could break into my house and take whatever you wanted without consequence?" she asked, her voice cold and calculating. Mike, never one to back down, tried to keep his voice steady. "We didn't know what we were walking into. We thought it was just another rich guy's place. We weren't expecting this?" Eleanor interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "Tell me, do you even know whose house this is?" The three thieves fell silent, each of them realizing they hadn't asked the right questions before they decided to break in. They hadn't cared. All they had seen was wealth, riches beyond their wildest dreams. They had never thought about who owned this mansion, who had the power to protect it. Tony swallowed hard, trying to regain some sense of control. "We didn't come here to make enemies. We just thought—" "You thought wrong," Eleanor cut him off, her voice sharp like a whip. "I have trespassed on something much more dangerous than you realize." The man who had led them here stepped closer, his eyes scanning the three of them like a hawk. "This isn't just a mansion. It's a place of power, the kind of power that most people would kill to have, but only a few are worthy of protecting. And you," he paused, his lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer, "are not worthy." Jesse, his anxiety mounting, took a step back. "We just want to get out." "We didn't know—" Eleanor raised a hand, silencing him. "I'm giving you one chance. Leave now and forget everything you've seen. Forget you ever walked into this place. Forget everything that's happened here tonight. If you do that, I'll let you go. But," she let the word hang in the air, like a heavy weight, "if you stay, if you press forward with whatever ridiculous plan you had, I will ensure that you don't leave alive. Do you understand?" Tony, Mike, and Jesse exchanged uneasy glances. They had known there would be consequences for their actions, but this was different. It wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. They had walked into something much darker, something they had no way of comprehending. Finally, Tony spoke, his voice quiet but filled with defiance. "What happens if we choose to leave? What's so dangerous about this place?" Eleanor's gaze hardened, and for a moment the room seemed to grow colder. "This place isn't just a mansion. It's a hub, a center of operations for something much larger than you can imagine. People who try to take from it often don't make it out, and those who do—" She let the sentence trail off, letting the weight of her words settle over the thieves. Mike felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. They had been in over their heads from the start. There was no easy way out. Now the question is, Eleanor continued, her voice steady, will you leave or will you force us to take matters into our own hands? The silence in the room was deafening. The thieves were cornered. There was no escaping the tension that hung in the air, but it was clear. Whatever they decided, they weren't leaving this mansion the same people who had entered it. The silence in the room was thick, every word Eleanor had spoken hanging in the air like a warning. Tony, Mike, and Jesse stood frozen, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. They had come for riches, for an easy score, but now they were facing something far more sinister, something far beyond their understanding. Tony's mind raced. What were they even dealing with? Power, influence? They hadn't planned for this, none of them had. Leave now, Eleanor repeated, her voice chillingly calm. Or stay, and learn the hard way what happens to people who meddle in matters far above their pay grade. Mike's voice broke the silence, filled with fear and disbelief. What are you talking about? What is this place? What's so dangerous about it? Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a smile that spoke of something ancient, something hidden, something deeply guarded. She took a step toward them, and her presence seemed to fill the room, as if the very air shifted when she moved. You think this is just a mansion, don't you? Eleanor said softly, her eyes locked on each of them in turn. A place of luxury, of wealth, of power. But this house, this mansion, was never built for comfort. It was built to protect something. Something people would kill for. Tony felt a chill run down his spine. What are you saying? He whispered. The man who had led them through the house, whom they now realized was more of a guardian than a mere resident, stepped forward, his eyes hard. This mansion is the home of secrets, and you've just stumbled into one of the most dangerous places in the world. Jesse's voice quivered. What kind of secrets? What's really going on here? Eleanor took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. You think the rich and powerful hide their wealth in plain sight, in vaults or offshore accounts? You think they protect their fortunes with just security guards and alarms? No. The truly dangerous people, the ones who hold real power, they hide their most valuable possessions in places like this, places where no one would think to look, and the people who try to take from them. She paused, her eyes hardening. They pay the price. Mike was trembling now, realizing the gravity of their situation. What do you want from us? He whispered, his voice barely audible. We'll leave. We'll go. Just let us go. Eleanor's eyes softened, but only for a moment. I could let you go, she said slowly. But you would never truly leave this place. The house would never let you. You'd be marked. And then you'd be hunted. Tony shook his head. What does that even mean? Who would hunt us? Think of this mansion like a living thing. The man who had been silent up until now spoke, his voice steady but dark. It has protectors, those who guard its secrets, and those who betray its sanctity are never allowed to leave. Not in any sense that matters. They're tracked, they're hunted, and no matter where they go, they'll never be free. The cold, truth sank in like a stone in their stomachs. This wasn't just about robbing some rich guy's mansion. This was about something much bigger, something they could barely grasp. Tony swallowed hard, his throat dry. You're saying we'll never be able to leave, no matter what we do? Eleanor nodded slowly. You'll always be marked. You will always be hunted. The house does not forget. Jesse's eyes darted around, his mind working overtime. He had heard of people who could make someone disappear, who could hide things away, but this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. What do you want from us? He repeated, his voice trembling now. You're saying we can't leave, but what if we could work for you? There was a long pause, the room heavy with the weight of his words. Eleanor turned toward him, her expression unreadable. Work for me? She repeated, as if testing the words. You're asking for a deal, but tell me, why should I give you a chance? After everything you've done, after breaking into my home and trespassing on something that you have no business being involved with? Tony stepped forward, his voice low but desperate. Because we're not enemies, we don't want trouble. We'll work for you, help you keep this place safe. Just give us a chance. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. The tension in the room seemed to stretch taut. She was weighing their words, calculating their worth. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Maybe," she said, her voice cool, "maybe you could be useful. But understand this, if you choose to stay, you don't leave. Not the same way you came in. You are now part of something far bigger than yourselves, and from this moment on, you are bound to the house. You're not just in my debt, you're in the debt of the mansion itself." A shiver ran down Tony's spine. He could feel it now, the weight of their decisions, the cold press of reality against them. If they stayed, there was no going back. But if they left, they would never be free. Eleanor's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. You can't outrun this place. No one ever does. For a moment, the thieves were paralyzed by the truth of her words. Their escape had turned into a choice between staying in this strange, dark place or risking everything to try and flee, knowing that it would cost them far more than they could imagine. "Make your decision," Eleanor said softly, stepping back into the shadows. "But remember, whatever you choose, there will be consequences." The air in the room seemed to freeze. The weight of Eleanor's words settled heavily on the thieves' shoulders. They stood motionless, locked in the harsh reality of their choices. What was once a simple heist had turned into something far darker. Escape wasn't an option, at least. Not in the way they had imagined. Tony, Mike, and Jesse exchanged glances, the urgency of their situation clawing at them. The mansion, or rather the fortress they had stumbled into, now held them captive, not just physically but mentally. The offer they had been given, a chance to work for Eleanor and be bound to this place, was their only way out. But the cost, the price of that freedom, was steep, and none of them had any idea what they were getting into. Tony's voice broke the silence, quiet but determined. "You said we don't leave the same way we came in. What does that mean? What are you asking us to do?" Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes piercing into his soul. "It means exactly what it sounds like. If you stay, you will work for me. You will protect this house, its secrets, and its legacy. And in return, you will be allowed to remain here, under my protection." Mike shifted uncomfortably. Protection? Protection from what? Eleanor's expression didn't waver. Protection from those who would want to take from us, from the people who would destroy everything this house stands for, and from the house itself, should it decide you're not worthy of its protection. Jesse's heart raced. The house, what does that mean? The house is alive. Eleanor's lips curled into a slight enigmatic smile. Alive, in a way. It's a living entity in the sense that it reacts to threats, real or perceived. And once you've entered its walls, it chooses whether you're a threat or not. If it decides you are, the consequences are severe. The house has a way of ensuring that those who break its rules are dealt with. Mike glanced nervously around the room. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating him with the enormity of the decision. There was no way out, not without consequences, not without paying a price. And if we refuse? Tony asked, his voice steady though his mind was in turmoil. Eleanor's smile faded, replaced by an almost pitying look. If you refuse, you will never leave. You will be hunted. The house will make sure of that. No one gets in here by accident. And if you think you can walk out as if this never happened, you're gravely mistaken. The mansion doesn't forget. It keeps track of every trespasser, every thief, and it will find you no matter where you go. The reality of it hit Tony like a ton of bricks. There was no choice. They were trapped. If they didn't work for Eleanor, they were as good as dead. But what kind of life would they have if they agreed? Would they become slaves to the mansion itself? Was there any way to truly leave? Or would they be prisoners forever? Tony turned to Mike and Jesse, silently pleading with them to make the decision for him. But he knew it was a decision only they could make together. Think about it, Mike said, his voice trembling with fear and the weight of the situation. We can't go back, but if we stay, we might survive. We might even find a way to live, maybe even thrive here. Jesse paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair. Survive? Are you serious? We're talking about working for people who control something that's practically alive. This is madness, Mike. We can't trust them. Eleanor, who had been watching them carefully, stepped forward. You think this is madness? She asked, her tone deceptively soft. You've stepped into a world much darker than you could ever imagine. What you call madness is simply survival. And the mansion demands loyalty, or it takes your life. There's no middle ground. The room grew silent again as each of them processed her words. What choice did they really have? It wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't even about freedom. It was about survival. "How do we know we can trust you?" Jesse asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Eleanor's eyes glimmered. "You don't. You never will. Trust is earned, and it's never given freely. But this offer is the only one you'll get. Either you accept it, or you leave. And if you leave, you won't survive." Finality of her words weighed heavily on them. Tony could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The thought of running, of escaping, was tempting. But something about Eleanor's gaze, the way she spoke with such certainty, made him realize that even if they tried, they would never be free. They were already marked. "We stay," Tony said finally, his voice resolute. "We'll work for you. But we need to know everything. We need to understand what we're getting into." Eleanor gave a slight nod, her expression unreadable. "Very well. I'll tell you what you need to know. But remember this, once you enter the fold, there's no turning back. The house won't allow it." The man who had been silent until now stepped forward, his face expressionless. "You will learn the rules of the house. You will serve its purpose. And in time, you will understand what it truly means to protect it. The mansion is not just a building. It's a powerful force. And those who are entrusted with its secrets must never break their oath." Jesse opened his mouth to protest, but Tony placed a hand on his arm, silencing him. This was their only option. They had no choice but to accept. "All right," Tony said. "We're in, but we want to know what's next." Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Now you begin your training. The house has many secrets, and it will test you each and every day. Welcome to the fold." As the three thieves stood there, bound to this mansion, they could feel the weight of the decision settling in. The house wasn't just a home. It wasn't just a fortress. It was alive. And now they were part of it. But little did they know. Accepting Eleanor's offer was only the beginning. The true test was just about to begin. The cold wind outside howled against the walls, but inside the mansion remained still, eerily so. The towering structure seemed to absorb every sound, every movement. Tony, Mike, and Jesse stood in the center of a grand hallway, their breaths shallow, their minds racing. They had made their choice, but as Eleanor led them deeper into the heart of the house, the weight of their decision settled like a heavy cloak around their shoulders. Eleanor's gaze was sharp as she led them down the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors. She didn't speak, as if she had already said everything that needed to be said. The silence between them was thick with tension. Mike couldn't take the quiet anymore. "How does this work?" he asked, his voice breaking the stillness. How do we protect this place? What exactly are we supposed to do?" Eleanor's eyes flashed briefly as if she was deciding whether or not to answer him. She finally spoke, her voice colder than ever. "The house is more than just a structure. It has a pulse, a will of its own. And you are its guardians now. Your job is simple. You protect it. You defend it from anyone who seeks to harm it." Jesse, unable to hold back, shot her a skeptical look. "Defend it? From what? What could possibly be a threat to a place like this?" Eleanor stopped in her tracks, her eyes narrowing. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said slowly. "This mansion is a gateway, a portal to things beyond this world. Things people would kill for, things that should never be disturbed." Tony, Mike, and Jesse exchanged uneasy glances. The words were cryptic, but the fear in Eleanor's eyes was undeniable. She was warning them, but what was she warning them from? "Is that what we're supposed to protect?" Mike asked. "A gateway to what? What kind of things are we talking about here?" Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned away from them, her voice lower now, more serious. "There are things in this world that people have only ever dreamed of. Powers, knowledge, relics, things that can change everything. But they are not meant to be in the hands of just anyone. Some things are better left untouched." They followed. her down the long hallway, the temperature dropping as they went deeper into the mansion. The further they went, the more unsettling it became. The mansion felt alive, like it was watching them, testing them, its very walls closing in as they ventured deeper. "You need to understand," Eleanor continued, her voice now an eerie whisper, "the mansion chooses who it lets in. Not everyone is worthy. Not everyone can survive here. If you show weakness, if you stray from your purpose, the house will not hesitate to deal with you." Tony felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean by deal with us?" Eleanor turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "The house is a powerful force. It can influence things. It can make your worst fears come to life. It can turn your dreams into nightmares, or twist your reality until you don't know what's real anymore. If it sees you as a threat, it will use every tool at its disposal to remove you." The words hit like a blow to the chest. Jesse took a step back, his mind racing with the implications of what Eleanor was saying. This wasn't just about guarding a mansion. It was about guarding something far more dangerous, something that could change the course of history. And now they were part of it. "Then how do we survive this?" Mike asked, his voice strained with fear. Eleanor's gaze softened, though there was no warmth in her eyes. "Survival is not guaranteed," she said quietly, "but you will be trained. The house will test you, but it will also show you what you need to know. You will learn its rules, you will learn what it wants, and you will learn how to protect it." Tony, despite the fear gnawing at him, couldn't help but ask, "And if we fail?" Eleanor's lips curved slightly, as if she were amused by the question. "If you fail, you will learn what happens to those who displease the house. And trust me, you don't want to find out." The dark promise in her words hung in the air as they continued down the hallway. They finally stopped in front of a massive, ornate door. Eleanor turned to face them, her expression solemn. "This is where your training begins," she said. "You will stay here. You will learn what it takes to be a guardian of the mansion, and you will understand the weight of your decision." Jesse swallowed hard. "What kind of training are we talking about?" Eleanor didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she pushed the heavy door open with a creak that echoed through the hallway. Inside was a large, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with strange, ancient symbols that seemed to shimmer in the low light. In the center of the room was a table covered with unfamiliar objects, books, artifacts, and strange devices. "This is where you will begin to learn," Eleanor said, stepping aside to let them enter. "The house will teach you what you need to know, and it will test you. It always tests its guardians." Tony, Mike, and Jesse stepped into the room, their eyes scanning the strange items scattered across the table. There were objects that seemed to hum with power, each one more mysterious than the last. Eleanor stood by the door, watching them closely. "Remember," she said, her voice low and steady, "the mansion does not give second chances. If you fail, you become part of its history, forever." The door slammed shut behind them, and the three thieves were left standing in the dimly lit room surrounded by the unknown. The mansion had accepted them, but at what cost? What had they gotten themselves into? And more importantly, what would they have to sacrifice to survive? The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening echo, and for a long moment the room was plunged into complete darkness. The flickering light from the torches lining the walls offered no real comfort, only shadows. Tony, Mike, and Jesse exchanged nervous glances, their bodies tense with the weight of the situation. The mansion's secrets were beginning to feel far more real than they had imagined. "All right," Tony said, trying to steady his nerves. "What now?" Jesse reached out, finding an old candle and a match on a nearby shelf. He lit it with shaking hands, and the soft flame illuminated the room, revealing ancient symbols etched into the stone walls. The symbols seemed to shift when the light touched them, almost as if they were alive, reacting to the presence of the intruders. Mike stepped forward, scanning the room with wide eyes. "What are these symbols? This place it's like nothing I've ever seen before." Eleanor's voice cut through the silence, low and commanding, as though she had been standing there the entire time, watching them. "These are the first of many tests. The house speaks to you through its symbols. Each one represents a challenge, a lesson you must learn. It's up to you to understand them, to survive them." Tony's heart was racing, but he pushed forward. determined to prove he could handle whatever this place had in store. "And if we don't understand them?" Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead, the room seemed to hum with an eerie energy. The air grew thick, and Tony's senses began to dull. His vision blurred slightly, and a low vibration filled his ears, like a low rumble that seemed to come from the very walls. Suddenly, a stone slab in the center of the room slid open, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. A cold breeze swept from the opening, and with it came a strange, intoxicating scent, distant, almost ancient. Mike took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to turn and run. "What the hell is that?" Eleanor's voice echoed from somewhere behind them. "You will face the trials that lie beneath. The house will show you what you need to see, but you must be ready for it. Do not fear the darkness, it is your first trial." Tony stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward the dark opening. "You're not serious. There's no way we're going down there." Jesse glanced at the opening, his face paling. "There's no turning back now, she's right. We have to face whatever this is." Reluctantly, Tony nodded, stepping closer to the hole. "All right, let's get this over with." The three of them approached the opening, the dim candlelight flickering with each step they took. As they reached the edge, a sudden coldness gripped them, and the air grew thick with an energy they couldn't quite comprehend. Tony reached out cautiously and took the first step into the darkness, followed by Mike and Jesse. The space below was narrow, the walls slick with moisture, and the faintest whispering seemed to rise from the very floorboards. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing beneath their feet. They moved cautiously, the path twisting and turning as they descended deeper into the earth. It wasn't long before they arrived in what could only be described as a cavernous ancient room, lit by hundreds of flickering candles placed strategically throughout the space. In the center stood a stone pedestal, atop which rested an old, weathered book. "That's it," Jesse whispered, his voice filled with awe. "That's what we need to figure out, right? The book." Tony's eyes were glued to the pedestal. "Yeah, but something doesn't feel right about this place." Suddenly the room shifted, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The whispers grew louder, the voices unintelligible, a cacophony that seemed to invade their minds. Tony's heart raced as the ground beneath them trembled. Mike grabbed Tony's arm. "We need to get out of here, now." But it was too late. The cavern started to shift, the walls folding inward, and the floor beneath them began to buckle. The ceiling groaned under the pressure. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them, until they were no longer just in their ears, but in their minds. "Take it," a voice boomed from the depths of the room. "Take the book, prove your worth." Tony hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, but something was drawing him forward, compelling him to reach out and touch the book. It wasn't a choice anymore, it was a command from the house itself. "I can't," Tony shouted, his voice barely audible over the growing noise. "This isn't right." But before anyone could respond, Jesse rushed forward, unable to resist any longer. His hand touched the book, and a surge of energy shot through him, his body, jerking back in pain. A burst of bright light filled the room, blinding them all for a moment. When the light finally faded, Jesse was standing in the center of the room, his eyes wide and unfocused. His body was trembling. He looked like he had just witnessed something beyond comprehension. "Jesse!" Mike shouted, rushing toward him. "What happened?" Jesse's voice was low, hollow. "The house. It showed me something. A vision. The book. It's a key to something much bigger. But it's not just a key. It's a trap." Tony's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, a trap?" Jesse slowly lifted his head, his expression distant, as if the vision still lingered in his mind. "I saw the mansion. But it was different. Alive. It was feeding on us, on our fear. The house isn't just protecting something, it's feeding off us, and it wants more." A chill ran through all three of them as the full weight of their predicament hit. They weren't just servants to the house. They were pawns in a much larger, more sinister game. The whispering voices began again, louder this time, swirling around them as the walls of the cavern seemed to close in even tighter. "We need to leave," Tony said, his voice tense with urgency. "Now!" But as they turned to flee, the room began to warp, twisting and bending like it was alive. The path they had taken to get there was gone, replaced by a maze of shifting walls and corridors. They were trapped, and worse, something was coming for them. The walls of the cavern seemed to pulse with life, vibrating under the pressure of the house's unnatural energy. Every movement, every step they took, was met with an unsettling groan, as if the very air around them was alive, watching, calculating. Tony, Mike, and Jesse stood in the center of the room, their breath ragged, their minds scrambling for a way out. The house was no longer just a structure. It was a force, a living, breathing entity that demanded something from them. "We're not going to make it out of here, are we?" Jesse's voice trembled, his eyes wide with fear. His hand was still clenched around the book, but it felt like a weight, heavy with the consequences of its power. Tony glanced around, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to stay calm. There has to be a way out." His words were more for himself than for the others, trying to keep his nerves steady as the labyrinth of walls closed in around them. Mike grabbed Jesse's shoulder, shaking him. "Jesse, snap out of it. We need to move now." But Jesse just stood there, frozen, his eyes still distant as if trapped in the vision the house had shown him. The house's influence had a hold on him, and it wasn't letting go. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, a deep rumbling that came from the very core of the mansion. The walls shifted violently, as though the house itself was rearranging its insides. A loud groaning sound filled the air, followed by a crash that shook the cavern's walls. Tony looked up, his pulse quickening. "We're running out of time." Without another word, Tony grabbed Jesse's arm, pulling him toward the closest exit, but as he tugged, the floor split open beneath them with a deafening roar. They all fell, tumbling through the air as the room turned into a blur of twisting stone. The world around them blurred, and they hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud. When Tony finally managed to open his eyes, he was no longer in the cavern. He was back in the mansion, somewhere deeper than he had ever been. The atmosphere was thick with darkness, but there was a strange, almost comforting light flickering in the distance. It beckoned them forward. Mike stood up first, wiping dust from his clothes. What the hell just happened? Tony helped Jesse to his feet, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. "We've been transported. The house doesn't just trap you, it controls where you go, what you see. It's trying to break us." Jesse's face was pale, his eyes still wide with the remnants of the vision. "We're not just dealing with a house. This place is a living entity, and it has its sights set on us." A low growl filled the air, like the deep rumble of a beast, and the ground shook beneath their feet once more. Tony spun around, eyes darting, across the room. The walls began to shift again, but this time, something far more terrifying emerged from the shadows. Figures, dark, twisted forms, began to materialize from the walls. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like they were being pulled from another dimension. They were human in shape, but their faces were featureless, void of any humanity. As they stepped forward, the temperature in the room dropped drastically, and the coldness stung Tony's skin. "What the hell are those things?" Mike gasped, backing away. Eleanor's voice suddenly filled the space, soft but firm, like an ominous whisper that echoed from all corners of the room. "The house has many guardians. These are the protectors of its deepest secrets. They have been here longer than you can comprehend, and they will test you." Tony felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Test us? With what?" Eleanor's voice grew darker. "The house has no mercy. You either prove yourself worthy, or become part of the mansion's eternal history. The choice is yours." Without warning, the dark figures lunged toward them. The sound of their movement was deafening, and the cold air seemed to solidify into a wall of ice as they advanced. Tony, Mike, and Jesse scrambled backward, panic setting in. But no matter how fast they moved, the creatures were always a step ahead. "We have to fight back," Jesse shouted, still clutching the book. Tony looked at the book, its weight now more suffocating than ever. "This thing, it's not a weapon, it's a key to something terrible," but it was their only hope. Mike swung a broken piece of stone at one of the figures, but the creature evaporated into mist only to reform behind him. It was clear they weren't fighting physical beings. The creatures were part of the mansion, and the mansion itself controlled them. "Run!" Tony shouted. There's no way to fight them head-on. They sprinted, trying to evade the creatures that seemed to be everywhere. Every corner they turned, more figures emerged from the walls, their cold, empty eyes locked on their every move. In the chaos, Jesse's voice cracked. What if this is it? What if we can't escape? What if we fail the house? Tony's heart ached. He had always been a man of action, steal what you want, take it and run. But this place, this mansion, was different. The house had no rules they could understand. It wasn't just about taking. It was about giving, and giving a piece of yourself that they couldn't get back. We're not done yet, Tony said, gritting his teeth. We'll survive, we have to. But with each step, they were growing weaker, their bodies heavy with exhaustion. The house was wearing them down, draining their energy, feeding on their fear. They stumbled into another dark room, the walls closing in around them as the floor, beneath their feet, began to tremble. The creatures were closing in. It was only a matter of time before they caught them. Suddenly, Jesse dropped to his knees, clutching the book. I can't do it anymore. It's too much. We're going to die. Here, aren't we? Tony kneeled beside him, gripping his shoulder. We're not giving up. The house wants to break us. It wants to see if we'll break first, but we won't. There was a moment of silence, the weight of everything pressing down on them. Then Jesse stood, shaking but resolute. We need to use the book. Whatever it is, whatever it holds, we need to unlock it. Tony's eyes narrowed. Are you sure? Jesse nodded, his voice steady now, despite the chaos around them. We don't have a choice. As Jesse opened the book, the symbols from the walls seemed to light up, glowing with an otherworldly power. The mansion trembled, and for a brief moment the creatures stopped in their tracks as though they were bound by an invisible force. Hold on, Tony said, pulling Mike and Jesse close. Whatever happens next, we stick together. This is our last chance. The mansion was watching them, waiting to see what they would do next, and they had just set into motion a force that could either save them or destroy them completely.